No, good.
All right, hopefully.
Okay, we're on. Assalamu alaikum, Dr.
Assalamu
Mahan.
alaikum wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let folks hop in. It takes
All right,
sometimes a
let them
delay.
settle in, inshallah. Night
Very
6.
good.
We are,
Night
this
6.
marks, that's right, this marks, we are 1/5 of the way.
Yeah, 20%. 6 times 5 is
20%.
30.
That's right.
All right. Well, we have a couple of questions. People view sometimes the video, or they ask questions at the last minute and we don't get to them, or they view it afterwards and they can still leave comments. So a couple of questions came in. Maybe we can address those towards the beginning.
I really appreciate, I'm not sure who it was, but I really appreciated the brother who said, I really enjoyed listening to you guys, even though you are trying to appease the feminists and saying that, that the obedience is to God and not to the husband. And he was of the opinion that the obedience is to the husband, has to be to the husband. And I appreciate that comment very much. But I just have to say that we're not making this stuff up, right? So it's not, we had no pre-plan between Dr. Mahan and myself to appease the feminists tonight. I mean, these evenings are truly agenda-free, unscripted opportunities to sincerely engage the text. And one of the points that's been made, and I think rightly so, is that when the Qur'an refers to qunut in all the other spaces, it is always about reverence and obedience to God, and not to another human being. And so there is ample justification for that reading of the what was that, Surah 4, 134? Is that what the verse was?
434.
434. And so but I appreciate the sincerity and the candor of that comment. And again, these are evenings when we are doing our best to engage the Quran honestly and sincerely and in an open and unscripted way, without Dr. Mahan and I don't have an opportunity to pre-plan these evenings or to script these evenings, so it truly is unscripted. And remember, we are working through the Quran in 30 different portions. Again, and there's nothing scriptural about that. This is just a way that the tradition has divided the Quran up for the 30 nights of Ramadan. And as we do so, we know that we're working with a book that is more circular than it is linear. So it's a very unique kind of text, but also that we're working almost counter chronologically. So we're almost working, because the beginning of the Quran, the longest chapters are the latest chapters. And as we move through those long chapters, and as we do, you'll notice that those chapters are getting shorter, and we're moving backwards in time. And so, we're truly trying to engage these texts with an understanding of their context, wherever we can see that context, but also just as sincere seekers. And so I appreciate the comment, and I hope that we have a chance to engage in a more robust way as we journey forward, inshallah. The mission and vision of the American Islamic College, to me, pretty much now synonymous with the work. I believe in the transformative power of education, and not just education that is informative, but in education that is transformative, education that really changes how we live. But I think that the Muslims of America need a place that they can come as a Muslim space. This is their space. It belongs to them.
All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. One more question we got from last time, which was, does turning to the east or the west mean here to do with Christian church construction? This is from the second night where we had the verse on bir. Ayatul bir, it's number 177 of Surah Al-Baqarah. And there was a Wikipedia link that the person shared that mentioned that, church construction was oriented in that way. And I'm looking at the study. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think this was one of our Indonesian brothers who raised that question.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think so.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm looking at the study Qur'an, and it says it is reported. I mean, there's a longer entry here, but it says it is reported that this verse was revealed when, after coming to Medina, the Muslims observed the Jews praying westward and the Christians eastward. So it could have been a reference that the orientation isn't the be all and end all of prayer.
And yet it's true that in most Orthodox and Catholic churches, at least, the tabernacle, as well as most traditional Orthodox synagogues, the tabernacle is usually in the direction of Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem would be the holy site for the direction and the architecture of both Christian churches as well as synagogues traditionally. And so I'm not sure about I'm not sure how the Christians in Arabia would have been praying to the east, but again, I wasn't there, so I can't say what was happening there. But I think that the point can also be taken more generally, is that that ultimately what's most important is not what direction you face, but what's most important are all the things that are listed so beautifully in that verse. Feeding the poor, taking care of the orphans and the wayfarer, and believing in God, and upholding the prayer, and doing all of the things that are core to this ethical monotheism that the Quran is absolutely promoting. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're now in towards the end of An-Nisa. The
That's
chapter
right.
is titled An-Nisa, which means women. And we'll finish this the last part of this chapter, and then start chapter number 5, Al-Ma'idah, which is the table spread.
That's
referring to the Last Supper.
Yeah, and so these last night I was kind of stressed because we were dealing with fear and war and all these stressful things, marital discord and all kinds of things. And one of the things that we see very clearly here is that the Quran continues to speak to the followers of the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, upon him be peace, but it also continues to speak to the peoples of the book, and the Jews and the Christians primarily. And the Quran is drawing lines, very clear lines, between what it perceives to be mistakes or wanderings from the covenant, the breaches of covenant and breaches of truth within those communities. But at the same time, some of my favorite verses in this portion, which spans these two chapters, are these verses where the Quran is actually can be seen to be calling out the peoples of the book and telling the Jews and the Christians to get back in touch with the Torah and get back in touch with the Gospels. And so I love how the Quran is drawing these lines, but at the same time, it's exhorting the Christians and the Jews to be better Jews and better Christians, and to really take seriously what God has given them in the Torah and in the Gospels, in which the Quran tells us there remains guidance and light. And so it's interesting because there's critique, but then there's also exhortation to the Jews and Christians to be better Jews and Christians. And of course, lots of exhortations for the monotheistic movement of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, and the exhortations urging them to be mindful of those other breaches of covenant and to be faithful and to really be steadfast in what God is giving them. So I'm not sure where you want to start tonight, Dr. Mahan, but we have a lot of interesting passages we can look at. So
right, and you point to a really interesting tension where there's this almost affirmation and the Quran is said to be a muhaymin, like a protector over the revelations that have come before, confirming what was brought down. And in the Torah, there is guidance and light. We're already in chapter 5 as we're referring to these things. And in the Injil, which is, there are lots of questions around what that is.
Right.
Is it the New Testament, the Gospel, Evangelium, the good news to Jesus? What is that? But it's affirming that there's guidance and light, and it's exhorting the people who believe in these revelations to follow them, and that you
Yeah.
stand on nothing until you establish hatta tuqim at-Tawrat wal-Injil, that you live by and judge by what has been given to you as revelation. And then on the other hand, we will also hear inna ad-dina inda Allah al-Islam, like the
Yeah.
deen. Now all these things have to be translated. The deen, which is the way, the law, the life way, in the eyes of God, is, if you take a literal translation, submission to Him, right?
Yeah.
But Islam will become an identifier for a community like other communities. It'll become a nation, a millah, an ummah, and so there's this tension. Like, if there's how to read these verses that are almost indicating an exclusivity and an inclusivity, one after the other, side by side.
Yeah. And I think, we talked about interpreting the Quran bil Quran, with Quran, and so I think none of these things can be taken just out of context, right? And so even the verses here that talk about punishments are often followed immediately by a verse about forgiveness. And so, somehow there has to be a holistic reading where the Quran makes very clear its own position with regard to things. For example, the refusal to accept the crucifixion. This is, tonight is Ash Wednesday within the Christian world, and so tonight is the beginning of the 40 days of Lent in preparation for what Christians believe to be the commemoration of the mysteries of Jesus's torture, crucifixion, death, and resurrection. And the Quran doesn't accept that death and resurrection piece, because the Quran argues that God, it only appeared to them that they had killed the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary, but that God had assumed him or taken him up into heaven. And so that's a difference. It's a big difference. And yet, in this is still in the Surah of the Women, where we see this clear articulation of the Quran's position on the crucifixion or the failure of those who plotted to kill
That's
Jesus.
verse 157.
That's right.
They neither slew him nor crucified him. Ma qataluhu wa ma salabuhu. But it only appeared to them to have been so. And there's lots of commentary on this, some of it drawn from the Israelite traditions themselves, which Muslims are allowed to draw on if they're not in open contradiction to anything that has been clearly revealed to the Prophet. And so it only appeared to them to be so. And people differ about this. They're just they're in doubt. It's conjecture.
Yeah.
So there's there's lots of polemical edge to some of these verses in terms of the theological difference. And they certainly didn't kill him.
Yeah.
They did not. And this is part of Muslim Islamic theology, that a righteous messenger of God who was sent by God will not be vanquished in this way. God will give certain protection, even though they be tested and tried along with their communities. And then from amongst the people, but God raised him up to himself.
Yes.
And God is the exalted and wise. And from amongst the people of the book, everyone will believe in him. There'll be no one left who will not believe in him before he dies. And so this is then taken as, when Jesus was raised, he'll come down as a sign
come
for
back.
the end of time, and he'll die a normal death. And on his second appearance, everyone will believe in him.
Right.
And from amongst
That's
those
so.
who are of the people of the book. Yeah.
Yeah. But this is a clear line, right, between Orthodox, what became Orthodox Christian belief, and and the Quranic Christology, the Quranic
Right.
understanding of Jesus. And interestingly, even with all the miracles that the Quran ascribes to Jesus, even with the miracle of Jesus's birth and the exalted nature of his mother Mary, the Quran will say about Jesus just what we read before. The Quran says about Muhammad, and that is that Jesus was just a messenger, like he was a human
Right.
being. And we're going to see that in Surah Al-Ma'idah in the same portion as we bridge the two surahs. But even with these clear lines, we'll read, as we go into Surah Al-Ma'idah, the same verse that you quoted, where the Quran is saying that, people of the book, you don't stand upon anything until you raise up the Torah and the Gospels and whatever was given to you, revealed to you by your Lord. So the Quran is still exhorting the Christians and the Jews, even with these maybe alterations of at least what the Quran perceives to be the alterations of certain things. The Quran is still exhorting the Jews and Christians to hold fast to what God has given them. And this is, really interesting to me.
No, that is. And then maybe 163, it's if I marked it correctly, very nice, because there's a mention of Moses, and then there'll be a lot more on Jesus, and in the middle it will refer to the many prophets, and these stories of the prophets will unfold in later sections of the Quran that we'll read over the course of, or at least refer to over the course of the rest of this month. But here you have a nice reference that we have revealed to you. And when it's ilayka, you in the singular, it's referring to the Prophet Muhammad.
Yes.
May the peace, and that's how it's read and interpreted. So we have revealed to you, and the we is typically read as the royal we of the divine.
Yes.
So we have revealed to you as we revealed to Noah and the prophets who came after him, and we revealed to Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac and Jacob and the tribes and Jesus and Ayub and Job and is it Jonah, Yunus,
yes,
and Aaron, Harun and Sulaiman, Solomon, and we gave to David the Gospels, the Psalms.
Yeah.
وَآتَيْنَا دَاوُودَ زَبُورًا. And I remember as a child, we would believe the four books, the Quran, Injil, Zabur, Quran, and the Torah, and the Injil, and the Zabur, like four books revealed to the prophets. And there are others like Suhuf Ibrahim, so here those Psalms are mentioned very clearly.
Yeah. And in
so
the verse right after, and the verse right after says, and there were other messengers whose names are not given. Yeah, right after that. We have mentioned to you before, and messengers that we have not mentioned to you before. So we've sent messengers that you know, but we've also sent messengers that we have not mentioned to you. Names whose names you do not know.
Right. Well, we have a question here from online. So when Jesus comes down again, and people will believe, will the Jews and Christians then become Muslims? That's the question.
Well, this is really interesting. I mean, we're into now Muslim apocalyptics, and and many people, I think, many generations have believed that their time is the end time, and there are certainly plenty of people looking at what's going on in the world today and thinking that. But
Right.
but it seems
You
here
know, go
what this
ahead. Go
verse
ahead.
is saying. How do you read that, Maan?
You know, the way I read it is, um, at- first I want to back up and say that there are different ways in which these verses have been read.
Mhm.
And
Of
so
course.
what we described here is kind of the general interpretive tradition that I'm familiar with. But there are others, some of them on the margins, some of them just outside.
Mhm.
Like I know the Ahmadiyya, who are on the margins, kind of they don't believe in the second coming. They believe that he actually already lived out a normal life, and so they'll read and interpret these differently.
That's right.
I think in the presence of a messenger, these communal decisions, especially at the end of time, when there'll be such great tribulation, will not be as significant, is how I understand it. And in the sense of they'll all become Muslims, we'll all become Muslims, is those who will recognize Jesus, then obviously will be those who submit to the God's messenger who is present right in front of them. And so in that sense, they'll all be those who submit, even though they kind of belong to different communal identities in the world at that moment. By the fact that they recognize the messenger, they'll all be participating in this act of submission, which will make them by definition Muslims with a small m, perhaps, at least, and we can also say with a large m, because they'll all become one community, right? But I don't want it to. When I say that, I don't want it to sound like, a superiority kind of,
Or
the
triumphalist.
Muslims will conquer and vanquish, the other communities, but we will all come together in a belief in God's messenger who will be present at that moment. That's
Yeah.
how
And
I
and
look
the
at it.
and the like the I mean the good news, I guess, about this is that the teaching with regard to the end times is that Christians are waiting for the return of Jesus, and Muslims are also waiting for the return of Jesus, and presumably when he comes, like everybody's going to be on the same side, right? and so
Right.
and so that's something to look forward to in a strange kind of apocalyptic way, but it's clear that from the Islamic tradition, it is clear that Jesus has been given this special task of returning to the earth before Judgment Day, and so this is something that's very strongly emphasized in the prophetic traditions, the prophets' oral statements about the verified statements about the Qur'an and about other aspects of the prophetic message, and certainly something that Muslims that even groups or even interpretive traditions like the Ahmadiyya or in some ways too the Baha'iyya, the Baha'i faith that emerges. It was a messianic movement that emerges from Islam. They have their own ways of interpreting that language, but that language is still there and taken very seriously and very centrally. And
Yeah.
so there is a range of belief from literal fulfillment to metaphorical fulfillment with regard to those prophecies and those Quranic verses about the end times and about the return of Jesus.
Okay, good. I want to mention two more things quickly on An-Nisa before we actually jump
Okay.
properly to Al-Ma'idah. One is, the theological polemics, if I may, are very charged here. And you'll hear things like, don't say three, God is one, right? But there's also such an affinity in many ways, particularly to a Christology that contemporary Christians would identify with. And I'm reading here in verse 171 in the middle, the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was a messenger of God and a word from him.
A word
And
from
his
God.
word, وَكَلِمَتَهُ أَلْقَاهَا إِلَى Maryam, was cast into Mary,
Yeah.
and he was a spirit, a ruh, from him.
Meaning from
So
God.
from God.
Yeah.
So believe in God and believe in his messenger. So that's where the, distinction comes in. But so much of it has such affinity. And there's a beautiful tradition that I always remember. A friend of mine would always quote this with such such passion. When the emigration took place, the first emigration from some persecuted Muslims who left to go to Abyssinia, they were
Yeah.
told that there's a righteous Christian king there who's Copt, who will give them refuge. And so they went and they sought refuge and they were granted refuge. And then the Quraysh, those who were chasing after them, who were in enmity to the Prophet, they tracked them down and they tried to convince the king to release them back as prisoners. And the king says, but they have sought asylum. And then they said they slander your God. They slander Jesus. And so he brought them before in the court. And he said, what do you say about Jesus? And then he recited from the chapter on Mary.
Yeah.
Um,
Which
it
at
was,
that time was known as Kaf Ha Ya Ain Sod, the letters
yeah,
that began it. Yeah.
yes. The
And he wept.
and we'll read from that maybe when we get to
Yeah.
the chapter 19. And the king was so moved, Najashi, that he recognized that there is a difference theological, but he took his staff and he put a line in the sand and he said, the difference between us is no thicker than this line. You have asylum. And he sent away the
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 Quraysh.
party that was there, the Quraysh. So
Mm.
so there's in early history, Islam was even considered a Christian heresy rather than a different religion, just another sect of Christianity, because of the way that Mary and Jesus and the birth are described, which we'll read in more detail later on. So there's a theological polemic, there's difference, there's a clear kind of distinction that's made Christologically, but at the same time there is an acceptance of the fact that they're deeply devotional and righteous people, and that the teachings that they draw on and scripture that they draw on is full of guidance and light. So that's
Mm.
one place I wanted to point out. The other one is actually right at the beginning of this sixth part. This is a really profound ayah, which says God does not like the raising of one's voice with an evil word, like saying something bad in a raised voice, basically saying bad things, except from the one who has been wronged.
Yeah.
And so if and I was just reading the tafsir of this, and there's so many different layers to it, but you shouldn't say bad about your brother or someone conceal their sins, but unless there's been wrong and harm, and it must be exposed in a way to bring about a greater reconciliation or a greater reparation. And I also think of this verse through people who are oppressed, and people tell them to be civil, and why can't you just have a civil discourse, which I believe and I revere a lot, and I value the need to maintain civil discourse. But when I hear this verse, there's an exception, like to those who have been wronged, genocided, or who are deeply oppressed. They can speak out in ways that are uncivil because they need redress, and
Yeah.
God doesn't like it, except in this case when He says
Yeah.
it's okay.
Yeah.
This
That's
is an
powerful.
exception. Yeah. And
Yeah.
وَكَانَ اللَّهُ سَمِيعًا عَلِيمًا. God is ever hearing and knowing. That God
Yeah.
knows where someone is coming from, and those who have been oppressed, have a license that others don't, to be able to
Yeah.
speak up. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a really powerful and stirring point. So as we transition to the next chapter, the chapter 5, which is the chapter of the table spread, or the chapter of the Last Supper, I noticed that the addresses are now not so much to "O peoples of the book," or it's to "O you who believe." So it's to
Yeah.
the community itself. So and so the first verse is "O you who believe." The second verse is "O you who believe," and we're going to see more almost legal discourses about food and about other things, about what's permissible to eat and what's not permissible to eat, and then also the instructions for washing before prayer. So we're going to see that there's some dietary and ritual instruction that's given, but then with lots of reminders about being upright and upholding justice, even when you yourselves might be implicated by the upholding of justice. And so it's interesting that we get a lot more legal discussions,
Yeah.
but the Quran is still going to address the peoples of the book as we go forward. And so it's really interesting to see the kind of the movement between addressing the specific community following the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, upon him be peace, and then going back to readdressing the peoples of the book, as if the peoples of the book, the Jews and the Christians, are also within earshot of this recitation of the Quran, and so God is addressing them here.
Yeah.
And
I would like to pause.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Were you going to continue? I don't want to interrupt your flow.
I was just going to take another leap. So go ahead.
Well, in the things you mentioned, I think it's worth pausing on this verse for justice. It's 5:8, and
Yeah.
actually it'll cause us to go back briefly to the previous chapter on Maida, because there's almost like a mirror. These two verses are working together, which is an indication also that the surahs are operating as a kind of a pair. And there are ways in which we can, see the pairing in more fleshed out detail. But the most immediate indication is the way that they begin, as you pointed out. The one was Ya ayyuhan nas, and then it was Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu, straight away. There's no alif lam mim or any other kind of formula. But they're direct addresses, but one is general and one specific. And then in
one
these
is
verses,
to all of humankind, and one is to the group of believers. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Sorry.
That's
Should
okay. That's okay.
translate for the general audience. But this verse number 8, "O you who believe." So again, it's the same. So that pattern of this surah continues. "Be steadfast for God, bearing witness to justice." Be steadfast for God, bearing witness to justice, and let not the hatred for a people lead you to be unjust. So when we pair it with the verse that'll be in the previous chapter, you'll see an inversion and a complementarity. So here, what are the things that will keep you from being unjust? One is you're biased toward someone, and the other is you're biased against someone. And so here you have the against. Let not your hatred for a people lead you to be unjust. Be just. Erdelu. It's such a lovely when you read it in the Arabic. There's the pause and erdelu. It's like just an imperative sitting on its own. It is nearest to piety, taqwa, and reverence God, right? And so have this piety, this reverence, this regard. Surely God is aware of whatsoever you do. All right, and then if we go back just briefly, I think I wrote it down. 4:135 is the other one.
I see. Yeah.
So in 4:135 it says, "O you who believe, be steadfast maintainers of justice, witnesses for God." Remember, it was the other way. Be steadfast for God, bearing witness to justice. And so it's reversed. Be steadfast maintainers of justice, witnesses for God, though it be against yourselves. Your ultimate bias is in your self-interest.
Mhm.
or
Or
your
your
parents,
parents.
or
Yeah.
your kinfolk.
Yeah.
This is what, keeps you from being unjust. Now listen to this note, whether it be rich or poor.
Mm.
So you could be favoring the one who's rich because you expect a benefit, or you could be favoring the one who's poor, even though the poor one has committed injustice, because you
Mm.
care for the poor. And the verse says, no, no, no. God is nearer to both of them than you. Don't think you can get closer to them than God. Your job is to be just. You can be
Yeah.
charitable afterwards. You can forgive, but don't change the facts.
Yeah.
So it's a really profound, and this is one of the reasons I think verses like these, there are other places where Islam is called the religion of justice, as
Mm.
opposed to when it's contrasted sometimes polemically, the religion of love, because there's so much emphasis on justice. But as we can see, we have rahma, and that's just a caricature. But there is certainly a strong emphasis on justice. So follow not your caprice, that you may act justly
Mm.
instead of being capricious. If, this is the next verse, if you distort or turn away, truly God is aware of whatsoever you do. And the next verse, just oh, you who believe, believe.
Mm.
This is just an interesting formulation.
Yeah.
Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, amanu.
Yeah.
you know,
But
uh,
believe in God and
yeah,
his
and his
messenger
messenger
and the
and his book.
book.
Right.
Mm.
And so,
So
what I read from this is you could be part of a community of believers, but you're really just going with the flow. But really invest yourself and believe actively, so that you can actually go deeper than just being
mm.
blocked, because you can get think. And when you get into groupthink, that's the easiest way to kind of almost mask yourself from the justice, because you're always in groupthink. So it's really difficult.
Yeah.
And the teachings here are, incredibly important, I believe.
Yeah. Absolutely. There are just so many wonderful and stirring places in Surah Al-Ma'idah that we could spend a whole evening on, but there's including a verse about Cain and Abel that
Oh,
is the source for some Muslim pacifistic theology. Most people who don't know Islam very well don't think that Islam could even have a pacifistic or pacifist interpretive strain, but it's definitely here and it has Quranic foundations. But I'm really interested in Surah Al-Ma'idah in these verses that seem to point to the divine intention of religious pluralism or religious diversity. And so I'm looking now at Surah Al-Ma'idah, ayah number 48. Actually, we can even go to 47, where it says, and the followers of the gospel should have judged by what God had revealed in it. And whoever did not judge by what God revealed, these are the ones who transgress. And we have revealed to you the book with truth, verifying what is before it of the book, and a guardian over it. That's where you were referring to as
yeah.
the Quran
Muhaiminan.
sees itself as protecting the truth
Right.
of what the Gospels and the Torah had communicated. Therefore, judge between the people by what God has revealed and do not follow their low desires. We've seen that in the verses that you just showed us about about um, about not following your own caprice, but do not follow their own desires to turn away from the truth now that the truth has come to you. For every one of you did we appoint a law and a way. So this is لِكُلٍّ جَعَلْنَا مِنْكُمْ شِرْعًا وَمِنْهَجًا. Like we've given a religious law and a way of life to every people. And if God had wanted to, he could have made you all a single people, right? He could have made you all a single ummah. a single religious community, but he did not do that in order that he would test you in what he has given you. Therefore, strive with one another to hasten to virtuous deeds. To God is your return of all of you, and he will let you know that in which you differed. So the interreligious, I guess the interreligious imperative here is not to fight one another and not to try to disprove one another, but to race with one another to do good deeds, and to allow God to clear up, whatever we disagree about, like in
Yeah.
the end, after we return to God. So, but this is really interesting because this is similar to another verse that we'll see later on, where it says that God created you male and female in different nations and tribes in order that you might come to know one another. But here it's that God could have made you all the same religion if he wanted to, but he didn't do that for a reason,
Yeah.
in order
Right.
that he might test us in what he has given us. This to me
Right.
this is really, just, how should I
Right.
say, it's kind of, it's mentally and spiritually opening
Yeah.
to read such a verse.
No, and it echoes something we read earlier, where it's really about fastabiqul khairat, like strive. You compete if you want to compete in anything. Compete in the doing of good. You'll know them by their fruits. The theological debate always has its limits. There was a place in Surah Al Imran. I actually wrote a paper on this, but we didn't discuss it in our dialogues here this month. When the people of Najran, from the south of Arabia, they visited the Prophet after his conquests over Arabia were reaching a conclusion, in order to accept his rule, but at the same time to engage in theological debate. And they didn't agree. The Prophet didn't convince them, and they stuck with their own faith. And so it ended up in this kind of mutual, they I'm forgetting the exact way to say this in English, but they just called upon God as to witness, but they left it at that. And so one of the great lessons in this is theological dialogue has its limits. It's been designed that way. You're not going to get into the proofs. And if there's any evidence that we have in the tradition, is this a debate that the Prophet himself had with the people of Najran. This is up to God. And early Islamic history is also, after all these theological debates, they settled on this principle of irja, which is defer judgment to God. There's things we're not going to be able to solve. There's just different points of view.
Yeah.
And this is an incredibly delightful position for a theological tradition to center itself around.
That's right.
Because you're always in the end saying, look, this is what I think, but God knows best. And this is why most of when we do fatwas or say things, Allahu alam, God knows best. And if a tradition can stay focused and center itself around that, there'll always be a sense of humility, a sense of deference, and a willingness to live and let live. We seem to have, I feel like we've forgotten so much of this.
Yeah.
That's right here in our founding texts.
That's right. And so the Quran is offering us a way to disagree and yet work together for the good.
Exactly. Yes. Nicely said.
And that to me is really, really powerful, right? That like this problem, we might call it the problem of pluralism, the problem of religious and ethnic diversity, the Quran says is on purpose, right? God did this for a reason, in order that we might be tested in what God has given us, and also in order that we might come to know one another in the subsequent verse. And so in the meantime, like, you're not going to agree, but you can still work with each other, strive with each other, race with each other to do good. Right. and let God clear up all the rest.
And
Yeah,
if there's one more thing, I see the clock ticking
I know, I
as it
know.
does every day. I do want to spend a moment on the two sons of Adam,
Okay,
because it is a
beautiful.
story that is also a biblical story. And in fact, it's so interesting in this place, the Quran doesn't just echo parts of the revelation that have come before, it actually directly alludes to it. It says, وَمِنْ أَجْلِ ذَلِكَ كَتَبْنَا إِلَى بَنِي إِسْرَائِيل. This is why we wrote for the Israelites. And it's
That's
almost
right.
directly quoting, the Hebrew Bible.
Hmm.
Um, and it's the story of the two sons of Adam when, one of the sacrifice of one was accepted and the others wasn't. And so the one got jealous and he said, I'm going to kill you. And the brother who was threatened, he says, even if you stretch forth your hand to kill me,
That's
against me to slay me, I shall not stretch forth my hand against you to slay you. Truly, I fear God, Lord of the worlds. I desire that you should be burdened with my sin and your sin. So he's delaying the outcome of this feud to the hereafter.
right. Mm.
Like, I'm not going to take on, this is a temporary abode, but I'm going to defer this to my Lord. And you'll be burdened with my sin because you took my life unjustly, and your own sin, which you'll add to it by wrongfully taking my life. And so become of the inhabitants of the fire. But this is like in the other world. In this world, my ethical duty is to kind of hold back from slaying my brother. Such is the recompense of the wrongdoers. And then his brother, he slew him. God sent down the raven or the crow, scratching the earth to show him how he might conceal his brother's nakedness, which is the burial. I find it interesting that anthropologists say that was the first ritual that, secular anthropologists,
Mm.
human ritual is burial. So there's some really interesting things here. And then it climaxes. For this reason, we prescribe for the children of Israel that whosoever slays a soul, unless it be for another soul or working corruption upon the earth, meaning it justly, it is
Yeah,
as though he slew mankind altogether, because
yeah.
the whole line of humankind was cut off from
So the
that
killing of
initial.
one person is
Yeah,
tantamount to killing all of humanity.
right. And whoever
Right.
saves the life of one is as though he saved the life of mankind altogether. And there's
Mm.
a beautiful hadith. Sheikh Hamza quotes this hadith. And so I'm deeply grateful to him for bringing these teachings forward. There's a hadith that speaks to the indiscriminate kind of violence that will be witnessed in the latter days of humanity. And we're like,
Mm.
I was in a session where we were discussing some of the violence that's taking place in the Middle East. And really, it was on Catholic social teaching and just war. And, even Biden had said at some point the bombing has been indiscriminate. And we know what both sides have been doing to each other, one, on a far an industrial scale, as you've pointed out.
Yeah.
And the outcome of the discussion was that there's, these days it's impossible, especially in urban warfare, to have any kind of a just war. And so I'm reminded of this, what Sheikh Hamza said, that there's a hadith, and which he cites, that in the latter days of indiscriminate violence, be like the better of the two sons of Adam,
Mm.
who, when his brother reached out to slay him, he said, I fear God,
Mm.
Lord of the worlds.
Mm.
This is a profoundly relevant and ethical teaching for our present moment. It's not easy
Wow.
to think about its implications, but when I come across these verses, I always reflect on the terrible tragedy of today. And it's
Yeah,
like,
and and I'm also reminded of the Syrian scholar and theologian Jawdat Said, may God be merciful to him, who's now passed away. But he built a whole theology, a whole Islamic theology of nonviolence based upon this passage of the two sons of Adam and the clear spiritual nobility of Abel, when Abel said that even if you stretch your hand out against me with the intention to kill me, I will not raise my hand against you. And so may God be merciful to him. I had the great privilege of being in his presence and hearing him speak once in Toronto. And
Right.
and he was someone, obviously, we know that he himself witnessed great indiscriminate violence in Syria. And so even in the face of that, he held true to that hadith that Sheikh Hamza and that you've taught you and mentioned to you. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Wow, I
Well,
didn't expect to end on such a heavy note tonight, but it's
yeah, I mean,
powerful
to
and
those who say that, right, and to those who say that, Islam is, they always view Islam through violence and that there's no non-violent teachings in Islam, that's completely not true.
yeah.
There's a context for everything, and the tradition is not lacking in deep ethical thinking, both in scripture and in the way it was developed.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Dr. Mahan. Do you want to close us out with
Sure,
Surat Al-Asr, as you always do?
sure. So I seek refuge in God from Satan the accursed, in the name of God, most compassionate, most merciful. By the passage of time through the ages, or by the late afternoon as evening arrives, we're all in a state of loss, except for those who have conviction and believe and have righteous conduct, and then they exhort each other to what is good and true, and they also keep each other strong in order to persevere in the face of hardship.
Ameen.
Ameen.
Thank
Be
you.
well,
Thank you.
everybody. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone who's here us in real time and also who will be here in unreal time. We appreciate you and we salute you, and we are grateful that you're making this journey through Ramadan with us. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.